So I'd like to welcome members and our viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV to the first public session of our newly formed Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. We've received apologies from a number of deputies and senators, Deputy Pat Deering, Deputy Martin Heydon, Deputy Breed Smith, Senators Paul Daly and Grace O'Sullivan and Deputy Tom Neville. Before I introduce our witnesses today, at the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Services, members and visitors of the gallery, I just ask you to turn off your mobile phones or to put them onto flight mode, as they will interfere with the recording system. I want to first of all thank Mauro Petriccioni, Director General of DG Climate Action, and his officials for coming before us today, Mr Jerry Kiley, Head of the European Commission representation in Ireland, and Mr Quentin Duprier, Policy Officer at DG Climate Action. I wish you a warm welcome to Ireland, and on behalf of all of our committee and the Parliament here, thank you for coming before us this afternoon. We're very proud members of the EU and welcome the recent decision by EU leaders to put action on climate change at the top of the Union's agenda for the next 5 years. And while our past performance on climate action hasn't been strong across our political parties, we're working hard to change that. Climate change has arguably never been higher on the political agenda in Ireland than it is today. And just a few weeks ago, Ireland became the second country in the world to declare a biodiversity and climate emergency, sending a strong message that our Oireachtas is taking these interlinked global challenges extremely seriously. However, it's vital that we go further than a political declaration, and what we really now is decisive action. A recently published report by this committee sets out more than 40 priority recommendations for government and state agencies. It addresses actions across all relevant sectors and proposes a new governance framework for climate policy that will pave the way for more transformational changes in individual sectors. The Government is now poised to set out its climate action roadmap, with Minister Richard Bruton's all-of-government plan due to come before us in the coming weeks. And this will build on our report, setting out practical actions to support Ireland to play our part in fairly addressing the global challenge of climate change. This committee will be responsible for scrutinising that all-of-government plan, and we will hold ministers and public officials to account for its delivery. Until the end of this year, we'll also continue our work to look further at climate policy in Ireland and continue to drive action contributing to Ireland's national energy and climate plan due to the European Commission in December. And we hope to have an extension of our mandate to become a permanent committee so that we would hold government to account on an ongoing basis. So I'd like to see our political parties continue to work together so we have, as we have so well up until now, in charting a course to stronger action on climate change in Ireland, with continued cross-party support and much work across government and all sections of our economy and society. I believe that we can get Ireland back on track and keep us on track in meeting our international climate change obligations. So we look forward to hearing from you on the strategy for Europe to become the world's first major economy to go climate neutral by 2050. Mauro Petriccioni, if you want to give your opening address, we'd be happy to hear you.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you for your very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be here in front of this committee to give evidence on the proposals by the European Commission for a climate-neutral Europe by 2050. Before I do that, I will not make any premise on the situation, the impact of climate change. I think it would be superfluous in front of this particular committee. Suffice it to say that our concerns continue to increase. The science not only has been very clear from the IPCC report last year on the impacts of 1.5 degrees of global warming, but every additional piece of scientific information confirms and describes a situation which is perhaps even more difficult than we had envisaged. So the urgency of the situation is evident. As you have pointed out yourself, we look at the situation in Ireland with some concerns, and we do look forward to the new national plans to have a clear view of how Ireland intends to redress certain shortcomings. I have to say very frankly, this is not a surprise, nor is it a unique situation in Europe. I think this transformation is massive. It's going to tax the way we all think in policy making in Europe, and there are shortcomings across the European Union. They differ and they are rooted in different national realities. But this is the time for all of us to work together to correct them. You've mentioned the National Energy and Climate Plan that Ireland has presented in a draft form. The Commission will issue recommendations for all these plans by the end of June. The objective of the Commission is not to sit in judgment on the national plans, is to point out where more work is required, to encourage an exchange of best practice among Member States, to flag best practices that other Member States could study and imitate, and arrive at a better picture at the end of this year in terms of the national plans and their overall coherence. We do not expect that these plans will be perfect. There is a lot of work that requires to be done in Europe, and in certain areas it's clearly that the national legislative and regulatory work will not happen in the space of a few months. This is the start of a process of continuous dialogue among Member States with the European institutions to improve our policies towards 2030. We all know that the policies that we have adopted and legislated for 2030 in themselves will not help us do our part in reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. But they are, contrary to the views of some, profoundly transformative. If they are implemented in full and correctly, they are capable of changing the way we address the problem, and they are capable of teaching us how to continue to accelerate our policy making towards an objective of climate neutrality. That is one of the reasons why the Commission has wanted to propose climate neutrality as an objective. We feel that we need to have an end point which is sufficiently ambitious to reach the objective that we have to reach, so as to guide us in further development of our policies after 2030. At the moment, however, this is only a proposal by the Commission. And one of the criticisms that we receive often, and we are not very explicit about how the policies will develop after 2030. I will try to give you some indication of that, but the important point is that without a strong political endorsement at the European level, and when we talk about European level, yes, the formal endorsement ought to come from the heads of state and government in the European Council, but we have advocated and we have tried to facilitate by supplying information and explanation. It has to be based on deep and strong national debates. We need to have an endorsement of this objective, yes, at the institutional level, but with sufficiently deep roots that we can look at its implementation over what is an unusually long period in terms of planning or policy planning. 30 years is not something we normally operate under. Having said all this, let me give you a very brief description of what is in the strategy. I mean, first of all, it's based on a very thorough scientific and economic analysis and on the best science we could collect. And we have seen recently a sort of confirmation of the soundness of that approach in the similar report that the British Council on Climate Change has produced, which in many ways confirms our analysis, in other ways takes it further. And we would welcome more work of that nature in Member States and elsewhere. I think this is an analysis which we need to continue to deepen. We have analyzed 8 scenarios. These are scenarios, they're not predictions. They're not a representation of what the Commission believes Europe would look like in 2050. But these scenarios are meant to expose a range of possibilities, a range of options, to allow readers to form a judgment on the feasibility of certain policy choice, on their doability, on their implication, and on what is required to reach them. 5 of these scenarios would reach a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of about 80%. They are based on what we call single technology scenarios. You take one main technology and you make a number of assumptions to push it as far as you can. Electrification, let's electrify everything we can think of. Let's replace fossil fuels with decarbonized fuels by using the same architecture we have in terms of power generation and distribution. None of these scenarios under these conditions is capable of achieving the desired objective. It's only when you start combining technologies and you start creating a more complex system which resembles the complexity of our current economy that you approach and finally reach the objective of net zero by 2050. The 2 scenarios that do that incorporate, one of them, a strong analysis on behavioral change, extrapolating from trends that we see in our society today, and the other one introduces a substantial but still complementary, not mainstream element of carbon capture. Our analysis nowadays is that carbon capture cannot be the ultimate solution that enables us to decarbonize our society without changing anything else. But there will be applications where carbon capture is likely to prove indispensable if we want to get to total reduction of emissions. On the basis of these scenarios, the Commission has made a political choice to propose to Member States to endorse the objective of climate neutrality. We have chosen that term to capture a number of the terms that are in common usage in this debate. We have, as you know particularly well in Ireland, a real issue concerning emissions in the agricultural land use sector. Now, European agriculture is one of the core policies of the European Union. We know that decarbonizing, eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector, at least in the foreseeable future, is likely to prove impossible. We have to manage that. Hence the notion of net zero, building on the fact that our land sector nowadays has a good carbon balance. Our carbon sink is effective, and we ought to maintain it, enhance it, and nurture it over time. And one of its functions will also be to compensate for emissions outside the agricultural sector, which may prove impossible to compensate. I'm thinking, for instance, of what is perhaps the most difficult area, which is aviation. All these scenarios, all these forecasts, all these projections are based on a prudential assumption, which is that we have the technologies to reach that objective. We are not relying on new inventions. We're not relying on future and unproven technologies. Granted, some of these technologies have not been tested at scale. They have been tested in pilot projects. They are known to work. They have not been tested on an industrial scale, some of them. So some of them, it is not clear how much of a scale we need to make them commercially viable. It is already clear that some of them would benefit from further research and further refinements. I'm thinking of batteries, for instance, with storage of electricity being one of the bottlenecks that we have identified. But the fact remains that this is a prudential analysis based on technologies that we have, that we can use, and we can improve without having to adopt a revolutionary approach or without having to hope that our scientists will produce a miracle solution. The other important aspect of this strategy is as much an economic development strategy as it is a climate action strategy. Our assumption has always been that a strategy for whatever purpose, even one as important as climate change, that could not guarantee continuing prosperity of the European society and economy had very little chance to be politically acceptable. And we have concentrated on developing a strategy which is as much a strategy for prosperity. The counterfactual, the existing situation is not satisfactory. We have an economy which is still doing reasonably well, but which has many fragilities, which is under pressure in terms of competitiveness from our competitors abroad, where we are losing technological lead, where we have to spend very important capital to modernize our industrial fabric in any event, and where our energy supply continues to be outside our control with serious implications on energy security and energy independence. We have tried to develop a strategy which addresses also these issues as well as climate change, and we believe that this strategy is capable of doing so. For us, it's an investment strategy. One of the difficulties is that much of the necessary investment is front-loaded over the next 10-15 years, and that will be a challenge. At the same time, we see an enormous appetite in the private sector for finding ways to deploy capital in this direction. And one of the priorities in the view of the Commission is to concentrate on ways to facilitate and incentivize the employment of private capital in this direction. So we see this essentially as an investment challenge as opposed to a cost issue. For us, the cost is the cost of the impact of climate change. And these are investments in order to avoid those costs. Madam President, I will stop here. I'll be very happy to answer any question that the committee may have. Okay,
and I omitted to just read out the matter of privilege, which I'll do very briefly, and then I'll go through the speakers in order of the speaking sheet there that you might have in front of you. So I wish to advise witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence relating to a matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against any person outside the House or an official by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. The first person here on my list is Deputy Dooley, if you wish to come in now, or I can take as members. Is that okay, Deputy?
Yeah, no, that's fine, and I won't detain you because I know there's a good few questions. First of all, thank you for being here and thank you for your presentation, which I think is welcome, considering the state of our preparedness to address the climate change issue, some which we all recognise we're well behind on, and it now appears, based on the Citizens' Assembly, who has given food for thought to us here in the Oireachtas to prepare a report which we just published, and which now goes to government to set out an action plan for addressing climate change. So that's welcome. I note from your presentation something which is often missed in the whole climate change debate, the economic opportunity as well, in terms of the potential developments, and that's something that's often lost. Climate change and the actions that flow from that, in the minds of some, require just a negative connotation. Of course, there's a positive. That being said, we must address too, as we did in our report, the necessity to have a just transition for those sectors of the economy that will be hugely negatively affected by the behaviour change that's necessary to address climate change. And I would hope that the Commission, not just from your perspective, but the Commission in its entirety, would be mindful of that in terms of supporting Member States who will have particular difficulties in addressing that. Just one question, I suppose, that you might be able to address for me. Just the consistency of the EU's climate strategy and the targets with the Paris Agreement objectives. Specifically, would you comment on the recent European Parliament resolution that the EU's 2030 target must be increased by 55% to get to net zero by 2050? That's based on hard evidence, I believe, but yet not every member state has signed up to that. Our own state, in fact, didn't support that. So it seems to me that we're just going to, we can't just talk about it, we have to get serious, and any of the trajectories that you look at in terms of getting there by 2050, the sooner you start, the easier it is in terms of the less impact on an annual basis. So obviously it makes sense to bite the bullet now rather than later. So maybe you'd comment on that, please.
Do you want to come in now, Mr. Pitcher?
I'm in your hands.
Will we take another?
Yeah, sure, take a couple out.
Take a few. So, Deputy Corcoran Kennedy, you're next.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of you for coming here to meet us this afternoon. You're very welcome. Céad Míle Fáilte. I have three questions. One is in relation to the just transition. In our considerations for our climate action report, which we presented to the Dáil and to Minister Bruton recently, we were very conscious of a just transition for our peat industry, and yet our government obviously has had to commit to no longer us using peat for energy generation after 2028. Now, we have 3 power stations. 2 of them are based in my own county. In Offaly, in Edenderry and in Shannonbridge, and there are very many jobs that are going to be impacted on over the next decade, and indeed that are already being impacted on. And so the question I have is that is it possible for Ireland to source EU funding for such regions which are currently limited to the coal regions? It's something that I'd be very anxious to see happening. The other question I have is in relation to agriculture, which is the cornerstone of our economy, and yet we are aware that it is responsible for about 1/3 of all of our emissions. So you've referred to talking about building the bioeconomy and the natural carbon sinks that are there, and I was just wondering if you have any comment to make on whether there are specific areas or actions that we can take to reduce our emissions profile from agriculture. And the final question I have is in relation to carbon sequestration potential, which is in our peatlands and indeed our capacity to increase afforestation. And I was wondering if the LULUCF benefit from carbon sinks such as these could be used to offset emissions in the agricultural sector or indeed other emissions across the economy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Deputy Stanley.
I want to welcome the panel here as well. I think that the that cooperation on European level on protecting the planet and on reducing global warming and climate action, I think is very important. So you're very welcome. Could just a couple of questions, just in relation to the industrial competitiveness question. That sustainable development goals seem to be put on this in the proposal you're putting forward. Sustainable development goals seem to be given put on the same level as industrial competitiveness. I think that's something that we need to, it needs to be examined. I agree with you. I think that in relation to your comments in your address, where you said that, while we have to reduce, while we have to change, and while it may seem burdensome, it presents opportunities in terms of different types of economics, different types of industries. And I think obviously that's the big change we have to make. But you just might comment on that. The other question I have is in relation to our failure. We put in place, I was here in the previous Parliament, the previous Dáil, and we put in place legislation back 5 years ago now for climate action, and with some concerns at that time, and I would have expressed some concerns that we didn't have sectoral targets, that we didn't have marked milestones in there, staging posts to reach achievable, measurable targets on a stage basis. And the concern is that we have kind of drifted into the position that we're in now because of that. And just your comments on that, how important do you think that is to have set carbon budgets? And the last question I have is in relation to just transition. Like Deputy Corcoran Kennedy, I live in a part of the world where peat extraction for horticulture and peat extraction for fuel and peat extraction for fuel to generate energy is being obviously will be phased out, and that's accepted that has to happen. But it has already created a lot of unemployment. In County Laois, where I live, there's a lot of unemployment, some of it caused by the phasing out of horticultural peat, where there was up to 300 people working in the summer period. There's now 3 or 4 people working there. And, you know, there is some kind of a package needed of matching funding to assist Bordnamona in particular, Bordnamona being a semi-state company, and in simple terms they're trying to move from brown extraction of peat, extractive industry, to regenerating you know, biodiversity and renewable energy. So they're trying to move from brown to green. They need help to do that. The need in the region of €50 million is the figure that I've mentioned. And just your comments on that, because we feel that it would really help the Irish economy. That's after coming through a very difficult stage, you know, with the economic crash, which we're now beginning to emerge out of, and would help part of Ireland where the income per head of population is a lot lower than the Dublin region. The Midlands has a very much lower income per head of population than the Dublin region, and we're anxious to try and create more balanced development. And I know that that's the goal of the European Union, that you don't want any particular regions falling, lagging behind. So just you might comment on that, and thanks very much.
I might just stop there for the moment, let you respond to those questions.
Please.
Thank you.
Many thanks for those questions. But let me start with the common thread among the 3 interventions, just transition. I mean, first of all, I want to go back to the issue that our current economic model is, in any event, being challenged by a number of mega trends. Climate change is perhaps the most urgent because of its disruptive nature on our entire planet and our entire society and economy. But if we limit ourselves to our economic fabric, digitization, automation, artificial intelligence, the development of 3D printing, the competitive rise of other economies in the world, they're all putting under pressure. And by and large, and I'm not saying this is an absolutely precise view, but by and large, the sectors and areas that are under pressure are always the same. So the question of just transition grafts itself on a bigger issue of accompanying the changes in our economy in a fair and equitable manner. We do have some instruments in Europe at the European and at the national level. We have made good use of them. We could all do with more and better. So I don't want to sing the praises of the policies that we have and claim that they are definitely sufficient to resolve the problem. The only problem I'm making is that this is an additional facet and add pressure to areas, sectors, people who are already under pressure and towards whom we already have an obligation to act and solve the problem. That might facilitate in some ways the issue because we can use some of the instruments that we already have. Second point, one of the issues which we have traditionally struggled with has been transition towards what? The problem has often been not so much finding the resources to ease the exit of workers from a certain sector in a certain area, but to provide them with viable, long-term, stable, sustainable alternatives. So the problem has often been one, not so much of what do we do in the immediate, but what do we do it for in the longer term. The development, the economic development that we see as a consequence of the climate transformation are at least capable, and I'm not offering any certainties here, but are capable of actually facilitating this. To come to the question of how to convert workers in areas of traditional agricultural production that need to be adapted, or the peatland that two of you have mentioned. One of the assumptions that we made in our analysis is that a very important component of the transition will have to be a very important development of the use of biomass. Now, to be usable for a climate transition, biomass has to be accompanied by technologies like carbon sequestration, but we have also to think of where that biomass comes from. We don't want to import massive deforestation from abroad. We don't want to alter our own carbon sink. But if you look at the analysis that we have made, there is plenty of space in Europe by improving agricultural practices, improving forest management practices, by converting what is today economically marginal agricultural land into the production of biomass, bringing back into production some of the land which has been set aside in the past in order to reduce our agricultural surpluses. There are objective factors to believe that, well managed, we could double our production of biomass and make that into a very important component of the transformation. That will happen, by and large, in many of these challenged rural areas. The instruments for a transition are available under the Common Agricultural Policy, under the Cohesion Funds, under the European Social Fund. I am not going to pretend that these funds are in themselves sufficient to solve all the problems of this kind that we have or we will have in Europe. But you know, and Ireland has been an important user and an effective user of these funds, you know that they can be used to very good purpose, and they can be matched by national funds. If well planned, this is one of the instruments we can use to ease that transition. If I look specifically at the question of peat as a fuel, I think your question also poses the longer-term challenge. Never mind the climate transition. Those productions are only there because they are subsidized. And we all know that in the longer term, at some point, the pressure to stop the subsidization grows. So in any event, we need to find alternatives to ease a transition. Similar problem, as you know, happens for coal production in a number of member states. Some member states have already taken the measures. I'm thinking of the Spanish government and the measures they have taken in order to ease the exit from coal in terms of closing the publicly owned mines. It's been accompanied by a very important social package supported by national and European resources. So for other member states, the situation is a bit more difficult. It's more difficult in Poland, it's more difficult in Germany. Other countries like Slovakia also exiting coal through the same mechanism of support or similar ones. So to sum up, just transition is essential. A transition which is perceived as being unjust or as adding unduly to pressure that some people and some sectors and some areas already feel has very little chance of succeeding and receiving political support. But we do have the instruments to accompany those transitions. The climate transition does not in itself create alone the problem of transition. It's a problem that we already have and we already need to solve. It might help direct us towards a longer term, more viable, more sustainable solution than could be otherwise the case. We don't see this as an easy challenge. We see this as a very serious issue, but we also see it as inevitable with or without the climate transition. When it comes to the economic opportunities, it's very difficult to express this without falling into one extreme or the other. But this is a climate action strategy. Its objective is to stop climate change, first by enabling Europe to do its part, and secondly, by Europe offering a successful model for others to follow to solve a global problem. But since this requires a deep transformation of the economy, we think it's impossible to effect this transformation by stopping segments of our economy. So, by definition, the only viable climate strategy is one that transforms our economy into an equally functioning economy, but one that's decarbonized and clean. And when I refer to the counterfactual, which I know reasonably well, having spent 30 years of my career in trade policy, the kind of economy that we're trying to describe to the long-term strategy is one that's probably going to be more advantageous to us and better economy than the one we have today, which is not to be taken for granted. Maintaining our economy today will be very expensive in the next years and decades. And that money could be wasted because climate change and the lack of resilience of this economic model could destroy all the efforts we would make in maintaining it. When it comes to the resolution by the European Parliament, there is a debate on what is the trajectory between now and 2050. If you think in terms of linear development, yes, the minus 40% that we have committed to, the minus 45% which we will achieve on the basis of our current legislation, if properly implemented, is not sufficient. Yes, you have to go in the region of minus 55. On the other hand, and I'm sure that you have plenty of experience as well in that respect, policy development are rarely linear over the long term. They are much more likely to be based on a progression where policies are started as one can and further developed and accelerated. And if you look at European climate policy, which we started after all in 1990, between 1990 and 2017, we reduced our emission by 22% while increasing our GDP by 58%. The 2030 legislation will bring us to reducing emission by another 23% in 13 years, between 2018 and 2030, which means basically doubling the rate of change. That will not be sufficient, but that shows that you can accelerate a policy change, and then in fact there are good arguments to say that if we had tried in 1990 to set the kind of target that would bring us in a linear fashion where we are today, we would have failed. So the point of view of the Commission is from a pragmatic policy approach point of view. The 2030 legislation is what it is. It is what could meet the consensus among Member States and with the European Parliament. It is already transformative. If I take just the example of passenger cars, minus 37% between now and 2030 is capable, I'm not guaranteed that it will, but is capable of triggering a transformation which will make further standards unnecessary, because if manufacturers are pushed to put a sufficient number of electric models on the roads at prices comparable to combustion vehicles, the market is ready to absorb them. If we do our part in financing the necessary infrastructure for recharging, for instance. If that doesn't happen, if those standards are not sufficient, we will have to legislate new and stricter standards for post-2030. But so the Parliament resolution is based on one assumption, that you develop policy exclusively in a linear fashion. That is certainly not true. Whether the linear development or a progression is the best, that is an open question. There is a debate. But it's certainly not true that you can only do policies in a linear fashion. And lastly, on the question of sectoral targets, it's another debate. Sectoral targets at European level, our judgment has been that they were very unlikely to be the basis for a consensus, and that it would have been very difficult to operate them effectively at the European level. It does not mean that they cannot be set and operated at the national level. And some member states have experimented with that, some more successfully than others. There isn't, I'm afraid, a perfect or even a good recipe to the question of sectoral targets. In the same spirit, if you see in the effort sharing decision and now in the effort sharing regulation, we have experimented with a combination of a European-wide target and national targets. The one thing I would add in that respect is that the tool we have chosen at the European level, and I see the number of member states have made the same choice, and that is now the case for Ireland as well. Planning is the tool to translate overall mandatory targets into specific policies and specific measures. Hence the governance regulation, hence the obligation for all member states to equip themselves with a national energy and climate plan. Some member states have gone further. One of the reasons I'm looking forward to seeing the whole of government approach that the Irish government has announced is because from the description here it could go further in terms of precision and reach of the plans that we have in the governance regulation. My own country has successfully experimented with allocating the national targets on a regional basis and involving the regional institution, the regional government, the regional parliaments in the planning. It has worked extremely well for the 2020 targets, and they are repeating the experiment for the 2030 target. So for us, what is important is a member state, we have created a European framework that encourages better planning, and we see that there is a take-up of this by member states, which probably in many cases goes further than this minimum European standard, and we think that's a very good thing, and it will be a very, very useful instrument for the future.
I might move on to our next round of speakers. Deputy Ryan, Deputy Pringle and Senator Devine. Do you want to come in?
Thank you very much indeed. I think the Commission and the Parliament, outgoing Parliament, has done a good job in the whole clean energy package, and particularly in the governance mechanisms which have been put in place. I think they've dragged the Council forward, and I commend the Commission the way they've done that, but now we have to act. The Irish plan, which we will see in June, is critical for us. I have to report that the work we've done as a Commission, we've looked at this in detail in the last year, shows, I believe, we will have something like a 100 million tonne gap to our 2030, or close to that, we can't be exact. And our National Development Plan, which was approved last June, had no climate assessment done of it at all, but the modelling that has been done since shows that it might only bring us 1/3 of the direction of where we might need to go to meet our 2030 target, let alone a net zero by 2050 target. It doesn't think that way. And just to give a couple of examples, that in transport, our emissions are projected to rise. Even if we get 500,000 electric vehicles, as has been expressed. The truth is our transport policy goes completely against the one you set out, point number 3 of your 7 points. We are continue to follow a sprawled transport model. We have 51 major national roads and motorway programmes under construction and in planning. We do not have a single public transport project in the same stage. Our commuting distances are lengthening. the emissions projections from that are not just in the transport sector, but in the whole construction of ongoing services infrastructure to service this sprawled model that we are following. Similarly, in heat, we've a target in our National Development Plan that we would have 45,000 houses a year, which would be retrofitted, upgraded to a B1 plus building energy rating. And last year, we only did at most 1,000 houses. So we are a minute fraction of the way towards achieving, even in the National Development Plan, where there are projects that would give us emissions reductions, the truth is they're not actually being delivered in reality, and the chances of that changing within 2 years at the starting point of this new strategy is minimal. The third example, I might say, in the area of forestry, where we do have the potential for carbon sequestration, storage, there is widespread public opposition to the nature of forestry in Ireland at the present time. Anyone here would tell you that the public opposition to the short rotation, single crop, monoculture forestry model has reached the end of the road in terms of public acceptance, and we do not have an alternative forestry plan in place. So in some of the key, and so going back to the heat one, if I can, just on that, we had an interesting session in this room yesterday where the key people working in the retrofitting industry acknowledged we have no apprenticeships ready to do the work. The department responsible for that is doing nothing about it. You cannot get the workers here today to start the energy efficiency work we need to do. I could go through the entire sector of the things we need to be doing are not happening. So that 100 million tonne gap might actually be an optimistic focus of where we are. So the three questions I have for you is, I mean, the government and the civil servants are working hard and diligently, and now there's great increased political interest in this subject, so we will try and do our best. But what are the adjustment mechanisms that the Commission intend applying if you see in June that there's a plan coming to you which doesn't have realistic measures to close that gap? What if Ireland, while we're committing to 30% as part of the EU's overall effort, and that feeds into Europe's commitment within the Paris Agreement, if a country is clearly not closing that gap, particularly in the non-ETS sector where our problems are most acute, what adjustment mechanisms do the Commission intend to apply, or how will that work in the 6 months to the end of December when one would expect this plan to be signed off on? And critically, in a country where we have a minority government, where the Parliament actually often has been voting, has real voting power, and I think this committee is a good example of how we can work really well together as a Parliament, what will be the access mechanisms for this committee or members of this committee to the Commission in this process? And what I like about the governance mechanisms that the Commission have written for this whole process, it isn't centralised top-down, it is encouraging consultation, it's encouraging open transparency and involvement. Well, I suppose I ask you back then, as committee members with a real interest in this and with certain expertise, having worked in it in real detail for the last year, what is our involvement in your process with the government? Will you be open to engagement with parliamentary committees or parliamentarians as this process of checking and testing and revising? And no doubt it won't finish by December. It's a plan which will evolve as we learn. And so I suppose it's an ongoing question is, what's the Commission's capability to connect with parliamentary systems in this evolving process? Second, technical question if I can. The other thing I like about the Commission's whole approach in this process is it has been trying to reduce away from every us working individually, but recognising you have to look to your neighbours to see how we make this challenge. You're required to ask first what could we do to maybe meet our needs by using interconnection rather than just every country going solo. We have a particularly different circumstance in that regard, in that we don't know the position of the United Kingdom. They have parliamentary elections next week. How long will those members sit? One doesn't know. But for us in this transition, there are two critical aspects of that. We are going to set a very ambitious, probably one of the leading countries in running a renewable electricity system, 70% of our electricity coming from variable power supply, and as an isolated synchronistic grid, that's quite some challenge. To meet it, we have to have much further interconnection, not just with France, but also with the United Kingdom. How do we write our plan when we're uncertain as to what the My preference is that we continue to see the United Kingdom in effect as a member of the single electricity market and do not freeze them out from this process, because it's in all our interests. It's in continental countries' interest because of the UK as a balancing partner. And on the same issue, with regard to gas security, our gas, all of it now, a certain percentage we have from one field, but that field will diminish in the time of this plan. We will be completely dependent on the UK gas interconnection. Now, I believe we should depend on that. I do not believe we should be introducing LNG, which would be a stranded asset, additional gas infrastructure. But what assurances can you give us, again in this Brexit world, and I know it's difficult, about gas security? What plans are the Commission making to try and ensure gas security in a very difficult political world with Brexit? And my third and last question is, what provision will you have for the integration? You rightly made the point that we're dealing with very complex systems, and the more we integrate our response. We've declared a climate emergency last week, 2 weeks ago, which I think is a very important statement by this Parliament. But it was also a biodiversity emergency that we declared. And I believe it's vital in whatever we do in climate that we integrate the need to restore our natural systems in the responses we make. And I'm interested to know how the Commission will see that working. I must admit I'm slightly concerned with some of the mention you made about massive increase in biomass production, because that may have very significant consequences for biodiversity in our island. I say that because you mentioned their marginal wetlands being potential production of biomass. Those marginal wetlands are vital as a carbon storage space and also for the protection of biodiversity. And also, we've seen in Northern Ireland, our neighbour part of our island, where incentives for biomass production, anaerobic digestion, have led to massive expansion of pig and poultry production and other. There are huge knock-on consequences from some biomass solutions that may be turned to. So I just have a question: is how do you stitch biodiversity protection into climate action within a plan?
Thank you. Deputy Pringle.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and I'd like to thank you for your contribution, and I suppose follow up with the very detailed questions that you've already got there in relation to that. And I just have a number of questions myself, just in relation to the strategy, and just in response to one of your answers earlier on as well. But if I could just start with that one, maybe you said about you're looking at how the policy is going to develop and looking at 2030, and you'll be able to react then to see if it needs to change and have a more detailed structure. I'm just wondering, at what point do you react? Do you react at 2030 or 2022 or 2021 or 2025 or whatever? And the example you used there was in relation to electric vehicles and the rollout of them. So I'm just wondering when that reaction would take place. Just in relation to the long-term strategy and the legal status of it, I'm still not 100% clear just on how actually you're going to you can force member states to actually comply with it, and if you could talk a wee bit more on that, because we are very slow to respond when there is a way of forcing us, but if there's no way of forcing us, I don't know how we'll ever respond to it at all. Also, just as well then, in relation to if you could talk a wee bit more again, I know you did address it briefly, but in relation to the 1.5 degree goal and reduction targets, now is the time really to react on that, rather than, and what you're saying is that the strategy, if it's successful, won't achieve that, but it'll show that it can be achieved. But surely it needs to aim to achieve that now to be effective in making that happen. And I think that's, especially if you're looking in mind that the reduction in stranded assets and stuff like that could happen if you set the target now to achieve it rather than waiting to 2050 or whatever. Also, I think the last question I have is just in relation to the use of fossil fuels in the strategy that the EU has at the minute, and how do we see the ongoing use of fossil fuels at this stage? It can't be a transition fuel really as such, and I'm just wondering how the strategy views that, and especially in the context of Ireland, where we're insisting on developing alternative fossil fuels and offshore gas fields and dressing it up as being security when really and truly it's not, and how does that actually contribute to the overall European aims? Thanks.
Deputy Senator Devine.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I guess you're starting out with the importance to constantly, and you have it in the cover of your presentation, but constantly to tie in not just the climate action required, but the economy, the economy that is needed, because that will bring people with us. All these the explosions of scientific evidence in the past while you scared the living bejesus out of people, really, I think, in the country. So we need something that's going to encourage as well, and positivity, the psychology of change. So I think we just need to say the benefits of it, because we're being scared witless. I think some people will find it just you put your head down. Change can be very difficult, but we just need to manage it as best that we can. I wanted to talk about the impact of the air pollution, really, within Europe, and 800,000 deaths, I believe, caused the causation by it, and obviously respiratory tract diseases, infections, asthma, all the impact that pollution has on public health. And can you comment on the approach to our air quality? Is it in a long-term strategy? Added to that, but slightly different, would be the climate, the migration that will be seen to increase in Europe has seen it over the past wee while, but it will be getting climate migration as well, and that's projected to increase. So do we need to look at our policies that are pretty poor in some areas anyhow already, and yet we're going to be inundated, I would imagine, with more people fleeing famine, flood, and not just the political sense, but also the environmental senses as well. And that question as well is projected by 2045, I think, or 50, 70% of the world's population will live in urban areas. So we have this rural weight load of 70% of the population, and a kind of a rural depopulated landscape. Has that come into your figuring about the impact of climate, urban versus rural? What kind of balances can we find out there? In Ireland as well, and we talked about it a lot, and Deputy Ryan touched on it a little bit, but our housing stock and the paucity of retrofitting, and it's much needed in a cold climate that we can experience, and the outskirts of Europe here. But would it be feasible for you to begin to think about providing really low-cost loans to enable people to retrofit? I mean, regardless of the government plan, where we only saw 1,000, and the rejection was multiples of that, and people who are just on the threshold as well have no incentive to do it, because they haven't got the means to do it. They're still borderline poverty if they go into those loans as well. And would the EU consider doing that? You were presented with long-term strategic options, 8 of them, and of that 8, 2 seemed kind of achievable for the 1.5 degree scenario. But it was the one that the 1.5 life, so it's a combination of the lifestyle changes as well as every other, picking up on every other kind of strategy as well. And that clearly made sense to invest in the 1 life scenario. And will you, as a Commission, prioritise the natural solutions to climate change over geoengineering? Last question, and I know I'm firing them all at you, is just about our emissions. We're going to miss the 220, obviously. We may well miss, I would imagine, the 230 targets, and we'll be facing significant fines. And can you comment on whether there's a real potential for these fines, and provide an assessment of these fines as well? Gormago.
Thank you. And I'm just going to bring in our final. I know there's a lot of questions there, but this our final speaker, Senator Ian Marshall, if that's okay, Ian.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, gentlemen, for the presentation. And I suppose in order to avoid repetition, and Deputy Ryan and Deputy Pringle have kind of asked this question, my concern was about the review process, because it's one thing to have the plan, but it's equally important to have a review process that if you're either ahead of the curve or behind the curve, that you can react. So it was more or less to get a bit more clarity on what that review process looks like, because the pace of technology is so fast that we could actually find that the landscape has changed dramatically in the next few years, so our initial plan may need to change. And the second point was, and it's kind of a more global perspective on this, this is a European strategy. how does it sit in a global context, and what does it mean? For me, I struggle. Does it sit in complete isolation, completely oblivious to other developments in other countries, on other continents, whether there's delivery or failure to deliver by other parts of the world? And does it take note and react to other global developments in the whole discussion around climate?
No, there's a lot of questions there. I appreciate that. So in any order you wish.
How long do we have? No, okay. More seriously, Madam President. Thank you very much. I'll try to be as synthetic as we can. But let me start with the answer to one question by Mr. Ryan that could also facilitate the anything else in case you find some of my answers insufficiently. One thing is the full respect of institutional relations. We will not interact with national parliaments in a way that diminishes the prerogative of national governments or that interferes with the constitutional process in a member state. Not only is not our role, is not our mandate, but it's anathema to us. At the same time, we are talking about debate, information, knowledge, analysis. That is our job, to provide the whole of Europe with the best analysis, the best option, the best solution we can devise. And that, by definition, not only includes, but perhaps even prioritizes institutional actors in member states. So as a matter of practicality, we have neither the resources nor the role to regularly contact directly national parliament, but the door of the Commission is open to any citizen that wants to communicate with us, much more so to people's representatives. So if this committee wishes to continue this exchange, if individual members of the Irish Parliament wish to continue this exchange, our doors are open, either directly or in person or by electronic means. Our representations in the member states are there also to facilitate this exchange. We will do the best we can. What I usually say, joking to people, I will always answer you. If you want a fast answer, you better make the point it's very urgent. The resources the Commission has is what they are. My Director General has 200 people. That's all we have to run the Europe-wide climate policy. I spend perhaps 80% of my time, to the despair of my staff, having this kind of discussion. So I say this in answer to Mr. Ryan, but also to say if there's anything missing from this conversation, we will be very happy to continue to provide the information that's missing under any practical guise. Let me go through the various questions. House renovation, it's a point that many of you have raised. We see energy efficiency as a key to the energy transformation. What has emerged from the overall view of the national energy and climate plans of member states is that current policies, and even worse, current ideas and plans for energy efficiency are insufficient to reach the 32.5% target of 2030, let alone being scaled up further towards 2050, where we foresee a reduction of energy consumption of around 50% in order to achieve our objectives. That is a fact. It's not a statement meant to scare anybody. For us, what we will see from the recommendation that the Commission will issue in June on the national plans is that we have identified this as an area for priority action. We need to develop better ideas, better plans, better measures, better policies on energy efficiency, and crucial to that is buildings renovation. Regulations on new buildings are more or less adequate. You can always improve, but they are, in our view, adequate. Renovation of existing buildings is a real issue. It's also the great reservoir of energy gains. In that sector, what we have seen as the major stumbling block is financing. And it's not so much the cost of financing. You can always subsidize the interest rate. It's not very expensive. But many individual homeowners, many small enterprises running, small clusters of building for rental purposes, whether it's residential or commercial, many local authorities running social housing simply do not have the credit rating that enables them to receive loans. Nor do we find that the scale required can be addressed by a publicly financed mechanism. By and large, this transformation cannot be paid entirely out of the public purse. It's beyond our capability. Having said that, I think we have concrete evidence that there is massive interest in the private sector to contribute. There is capital in Europe in search of gainful employment. The issue we have is one of measures. Is how do we bridge the gap between the availability of finance, the risk factor, and the uses towards which we want to direct that finance. It's possible, but not easy. I have one practical example. We are financing out of the LIFE program a pilot project whereby the Commission allocates a reasonable amount, over 5 years is almost 150 million euros, to act as collateral for commercial loans. It's beginning to work. So it is not a subsidy to the bank, it's not a subsidy to the owner. They are commercial loans, but the existence of public money as collateral lowers the risk profile of the borrowers and enables the commercial bank to make a loan it would find too risky otherwise. We've been struggling with this project because commercial banks are not used to it. They're not used to evaluating this kind of project because they've considered them too risky. So once they're too risky, you don't even look at them. We've had to invest money together with the European Investment Bank in training programs, in enabling commercial banks who wanted to participate to create teams of people who were capable of assessing these loans, quite apart from the question of the financial risk, but, is the borrower trustworthy? The rest of the commercial operations. It's now beginning to work slowly. Maybe we have a question, we have to decide whether this project is worth continuing, it's worth replicating, or whether we can do something else. But one of the things that we will put squarely on the table is that there should be collective work, European institutions, member states, the financial sector, to devise mechanisms to bridge the gap between the uses that we want to see develop for the climate transition and the availability of private capital, which is in Europe very largely unemployed. I think one of the natural but unpleasant effect of the tightening of our credit system after the financial crisis has been that we have made our banking system much more risk averse than before. Well, as you know, when we talk about appreciation of risk, it's easy to swing in the opposite direction. I think we need to operate a correction in that respect. There is appetite for that in the financial sector. There is work afoot on that, but it's not a simple issue. It's fundamental because the side benefits, apart from energy efficiency, of house renovation in terms of public health, quality of living are potentially enormous, and there is a huge real estate capital in Europe that could benefit from that. And I'm not even mentioning the situation of Eastern Europe, where much of the housing stock comes from the Soviet era. And you can imagine the quality of that housing stock. Now, Mr. Ryan, one thing you said that was, I think, spot on. Current plans don't think the right way, or something like that. One point that the Commission is making is that this transformation requires a quality change in the way we think. Emission reduction are no longer good enough. There have to be emission reduction capable of being scaled up towards zero. Not all policies are equally good in that respect. There have to be policies capable of transforming our economic model in a sustainable and potentially indefinite manner. They have to fit with other mega trends. We cannot think of clean mobility, electric cars, without dissociating that from the trends towards automated cars. This requires a radical change in the way we think. The point is that the way our world is developing will force that change on us, whether we like it or not. We see the energy transformation, the climate transformation, as one of the opportunities to take control of that process rather than being victims of it. We're not pretending it's easy. We think it's a generational challenge, but we also think that we are going to be challenged regardless of what we do, so we may just as well try and drive the process rather than be driven and possibly driven against the wall. The same, you mentioned forestry models not acceptable. True in many ways, which is why we're now proposing a European forestry model. Many of these things, many of these policies can only be devised at the local level. Agricultural policies, we do have, the biggest policy we have is the common agricultural policy, and yet you know better than many others how local that policy in fact is. If you think of mobility, maybe in a small country, I'm not even sure from that point of view Ireland qualifies as a small country. But otherwise you can't solve mobility at the national level, let alone at the European level. You can facilitate, you can create infrastructure, you can help finance, you can create the framework, you can create the impulsion like CO2 reduction. But mobility gets solved at the local level. Gets solved at the local level by local public transport, by intra-urban transport, inter-urban transport, alternative to individual mobility than the car, the explosion of shared vehicles, electric bikes, scooters. In Brussels, in the space of 6 months, 5 companies have started offering electric scooters, to the point the local authorities are getting increasingly annoyed because this thing just scattered all over the streets, and now thinking of regulating the parking of electric scooters. But I mean, that happened in 6 months. So the special distribution of territory, it is very clear that we have encouraged, perhaps unwittingly, commuting to an extent which has become unhealthy for many of our cities and many of our urban areas. What can we do about this? It's not going to be done at the national level. It's going to be done at the local and at the regional level. Even energy production. We are not going to replace the current totally centralized production model and totally diffuse consumption model with a clean, identical model. We're not going to go to total diffusion of the energy production, but we have to go towards a model of energy production which is more balanced, where we will continue to have large production facilities, but we will also have point-to-point production and consumption. And that is also going to happen at the local level. When I meet with mayors or regional administrators, a recurring question is, what policies can we put in place and what support can we get for local renewables, which is not the same thing as the massive renewable project that we used to think about. So many of these policies have, if there is a forestry model acceptable to Ireland, it's your choice. The Common Agricultural Policy is capable of supporting it. The Common Agricultural Policy needs to be greened seriously. So far, we have tried to do it, and what we have done is not sufficient. The legal instruments are there already in the existing regulation, even more so in what the Commission has proposed under the new multi-annual financial framework for 21-27. But it will also require a lot more cooperation among member states, with the institutions, with the farmers, to develop new and better models. And this is not a unique Irish problem. It's a problem which we find almost everywhere else in Europe. We need to find a way to have better agricultural practices, better forestry management for commercial forests, better preservation of primary forest cover, which in Europe is still sizable, at least in certain parts of Europe. I come to the point you made on, sorry, I may have misspoken, but I was talking about economically marginal agricultural land. Land which is today cultivated with food crops and commercial crops. But in some parts of Europe, the yield, the economic yield of that cultivation is marginal. Converting those lands to biomass could be a rational proposition for the farmers. I wasn't talking about wetlands. Wetland conservation is a primary objective, in our view, for the European Union.
Most of Ireland is wetland, I'm afraid. We have a lot of wetland.
Only in winter.
Again, we're not suggesting that everybody has to convert every meter of available land not used for something better into biomass. And not all member states will be able to use biomass as a serious source of power. When we talk about biomass, we're also not talking exclusively about what's grown on the land. When we talk about biofuels, we have to move away from crop-based biofuels. The Commission had proposed a phase-out of their eligibility for the Fuel Quality Directive. Unfortunately, Council and Parliament disagreed with us, and we have a very confused situation. But in the end, we have to move towards second and third generation biofuels. So we're not suggesting a mechanical use of the land from one transfer of one use to the other. But it's very clear that if we want to achieve climate neutrality, we need to use more biomass. That biomass has to be sustainable, and that biomass must not create havoc with our environment. The question was asked about the links between biodiversity and, there are very close links, extremely close links. You can, if you look for it, create a climate policy at the expense of environmental conservation. In the same way, you can have an energy security policy at the expense of climate. That isn't the point. That we are trying to maintain coherence, consistency. I'm not claiming that we have achieved it. I'm not claiming that we'll be infallible. But I'm pretty sure that whenever we fail to ensure that coherence, it will be pointed out to us in no uncertain terms. And frankly, that doesn't worry us in the slightest. On the contrary, we think that's crucial. I'm spending a fair amount of my time cooperating with my colleague in charge of environment, trying to ensure the coherence. You will see sooner rather than later the draft 8th Environmental Action Plan, and you will see a concrete example of an attempt to make explicit the coherence between climate policy and the rest of our environmental policies, including air quality. I think so far the biggest contributor to reducing emission from transport in urban areas has been our air quality legislation. Unfortunately, it doesn't automatically translate. From an emission point of view, as we've seen after the diesel scandal, petrol cars respect air quality standards more easily than diesel. They also increase emissions. And as a result of the diesel scandal in 2017, we had a peak of road transport emissions. Fortunately, it's gone down again. Fortunately, it was a transitory phenomenon, but I have to say it got us worried. So policy coherence is essential, but we shouldn't be paralyzed and do nothing because we are seeking coherence continuously. It is a continuous process. Let me see where I am. The planning process. I'll try to group the various questions.
Chair, I have to take a train, so apologies about that. I'll watch the remaining part of it in our video later on.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy. I know you did say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. We'll send the reporting to you. You'll have a transcript.
We spend most of the day in this conversation in other events as well. There is the short-term issue of the governance regulation, and there is a broader issue of planning. As far as the governance regulation is concerned, on its face is a one-off exercise. Drafts have been produced, more or less on time. We are reviewing them. We will issue a set of recommendations by the end of June. We do not intend to sit in judgment on Member States' plan. We will not issue a recommendation that will pass a judgment on the quality of the plan or anything else. Our recommendation will consist in identifying what we see lack of clarity as to how policies are going to be implemented and financed. In some cases, it is simply not clear. A policy is stated, announced, but details are short. Pointing out whether in a member state the policies which the plan does announce appear capable, on the basis of the information provided, to fulfill the objectives in the mandatory European legislation. And in a number of cases that will not be the case, and we will point that out factually. Those are factual analysis. We will point out areas where the plans could benefit from clear explanations, better analysis, complementary explanations, and we will flag what we consider are particularly effective examples of addressing an issue in a plan, so that member states have access to a coherent analysis of how one can improve the plans. The objective is to have better plans at the end of this year. And I have to say, the discussion we've had in the Council Working Group have been unusually constructive in that respect. There is a realization that this is a common problem, that no member state has the monopoly of wisdom, that there are issues that need to be addressed everywhere, they're complicated everywhere, and there is a very considerable desire for common analysis, learning from each other, looking at best practices, and we're very keen to encourage that process. Now, what happens afterwards? We hope and trust that this will encourage a permanent move towards better planning in the climate field. And we've seen a number of examples that comfort us in that. I mentioned my own country and the fact that the allocation of targets at the regional level is now being replicated for the 2030 targets. We've seen the Irish plan, you know as well as I do, what the shortcomings in terms of the policies are, but it is a very robust, accurate, honest analysis of the situation. We will point out that that is a good standard of quality in terms of preparing and writing a plan, and we would like member states to move towards that standard rather than away from it. We hope and trust that this can be continued over time, and we will find informal way to improve it. Interconnections, absolutely necessary. I'm afraid, apart from the reluctance of the Commission to speculate about Brexit, but to be honest, I wish I had an answer to these questions and to many other questions that we all have in respect of what's going to happen with Brexit. It's very clear that the long-term interest, certainly of Europe, particularly in many ways of Ireland, and in our view, we never hit that, of the UK, is as close to cooperation as possible in the future. As to what will happen, I'm afraid crystal balls are not part of the standard kit for Commission officials. Let me see. Review clauses, post-2030, etc. No, we will have the instrument to react earlier. Apart from the fact that even without any instruments, the Commission has a power of initiative, and we will keep the situation constantly under control. So if something happens that proves that the current legislation is inadequate, the Commission has the power to propose new legislation on the spot. But we have taken care to build into all the legislation approved with the 2030 horizon monitoring, reporting and verification mechanisms of various kinds, and there are review clauses everywhere, usually in the time brackets 2022, 2025. Depends on the legislation, it varies, but you will see a lot of reports from the Commission, at least during those years. We may do it more often if the circumstances justify it, but at least in that period you will see a lot of sort of mid-term reports by the Commission on the basis of which action may be taken to modify the legislation. But at the latest, for legislation which has to enter into force as of 2031, the process will have to start 2026, for a simpler piece of legislation 2027. We have an obligation to carry out impact assessments, public consultations, and the approval process by Council and Parliament is very often a lengthy one. So at the latest in 2026 you will begin to see the shape of legislation to come. The legal status of the strategy, it's a policy. It does not have the legal status of legislation. At the same time, I would draw your attention to the fact that the entire 2030 legislative programme is based on one piece of conclusion of the European Council in 2014. I go back to what I said earlier. The key is how deep does the consensus around Council conclusion go? One of the reasons why we are touring the capital is to help national authorities to carry out a more informed domestic debate. Our assumption is that this will produce an endorsement by the European Council which will have much greater depth than it normally has, and therefore much greater durability and ability to influence. On that basis, the Commission, the basis of that endorsement, will certainly take a number of initiatives. I am not in a position to prejudge today which, especially considering that it will be a new Commission whose identity is not even known. But one thing I am certain of is that a number of decisions will be taken. Some in the very short term, allocation of research funds, choice of research projects. That is mandated in the legislation now before Parliament and Council, and those choices will have to be made. And if the European Council endorses the objective of climate neutrality, I don't see how any Commission could ignore that in deciding what the research priorities are for the next few years. The question of infrastructure, interconnection, whether it's electric, whether it's new pipelines, I don't see how those decisions can be taken under EU Invest, under the Connecting Europe facility, under the cohesion funds, making abstraction from an endorsement by the European Council of the objective of climate neutrality by 2050. So those conclusions do have a deep impact on legislation and policy making at European level, irrespective of their formal legal status. And so far, the 2014 conclusions have produced a massive legislation. We're talking about perhaps 16 pieces of legislation over 4 years, which is, pretty exceptional by European standards. Fossil fuels, what's next? The transition, alternative fossil fuels. A fossil fuel is a fossil fuel is a fossil fuel. If we are talking about climate neutral society, we cannot afford to have the word fossil in our final energy mix. In practical terms, what does that mean? We have an issue, we have to decide what the future of gas is. If natural gas remains a source of carbon, it can only be a transitional technology. It is far from impossible that the natural gas could remain a permanent part of our energy mix if carbon capture technologies are developed further and employed. It could be what the Norwegians are studying and proposing is that natural gas should be used as the main source for producing clean hydrogen, with the resulting carbon being stored back in the caves where the gas came from. If that can be made commercially viable, that is certainly something we would welcome, support, help in any way we can. At this stage, we don't know. And the one thing that would be helpful is member states helping put the responsibility on the gas industry to decide what they want to be. Do they want to be a transitional tool? Do they want to be a permanent solution? Are they going to invest in carbon capture technology? Are they going to help address public concerns, whether justified or not? Even just the perception needs to be addressed. Industry can help reassure the public. It's in their hands. We cannot do it for them. Let me see whether there's anything. Look, I'm not going to go into detail, but your point you made on migration, urbanization, public health, it's very clear that unchecked climate change is going to make all that a lot worse. It already has. The link between climate change and migration are already proven. Migration has already happened, helped, facilitated, spurred on by climate change. That is an additional reason why the world that we have today is a world that climate change is making unsafe in more ways than one. We know that. We need to continue to communicate that and to explain it and to use it as part of the rationale for action, and for action faster than otherwise. The EU strategy in the global context, and then, Madam President, I think I will stop at that one if you don't mind. If we look at the world situation, you have, from this point of view, it's not as bad as it sometimes looks. Let me start with the biggest problem, the United States. The United States, this administration is intent on becoming the champion of climate skepticism. At the same time, there is a very large movement within the United States that continues to go in the opposite direction at the level of state governments, and that is very much a bipartisan issue. We have seen Democratic and Republican governors continue to be strong advocates of strong climate policies. At the level of industry, US industry is global. They are as concerned about where Europe goes as where the United States goes. And they are looking, especially large multinational, they do have a 20, 30, 40 years horizon. And they see where things are going. They realize that their own resilience to climate change will put them in jeopardy. They see their business model crumbling. So for us, what we see in the US is a pause. It's an unwelcome pause. It's a dangerous pause, but a pause. Even China, which is the largest emitter in the world, China is developing a long-term strategy. We have very intensive cooperation among our economic modelers. We have supported China in setting up an emission trading scheme. China has experimented with 7 different models in 7 provinces, a typical mode of operation of the Chinese government. They have now chosen to launch a national scheme based on the European model. We've been cooperating with them, offering technical assistance and support for that for years, and we're intensifying that. It will be a hard slog for the Chinese to make it work. We've seen the difficulties we've had. But the Chinese are determined to make it work. 70% of China's energy generation is still thermal, mostly coal. But at the same time, China invests in renewable energies more than anybody else in the world combined. So the Chinese have a very large development problem.
Sorry, on still nuclear?
They still have some nuclear, and they will continue to use, but so will some of our member states. Our projection, as you may have seen, is that we expect around 15% of energy supply in 2050 to come from nuclear. That is not a prediction or a suggestion. That's an extrapolation of current choices by member states on the energy mix. Now, if those choices change one way or the other, that projection will have to change. But on the basis of what we know today, that's what we have chosen to model. Japan will come up with a long-term strategy in June. It will be very similar to ours. It will not be as ambitious. This is a global problem. We are not going to solve it. By 2030, we will be irrelevant in that respect in terms of reducing emissions, because we'll be at less than 2% of world emissions. But where we are absolutely crucial is in offering the model on how to do it. And if nobody offers that model, it will not happen. And there's nobody else out there who is even prepared to try, let alone to succeed. We have a unique combination of factors in Europe. The pressure of our people for immediate action, for urgent action, is enormous, is constant, is everywhere. It cuts across, as you very well know, and your committee is evidence of that, cuts across political preferences in the different parts of the political spectrum. There may be some exceptions in some countries, but by and large, that's the situation in Europe. You don't have that situation anywhere else. The United States is a profoundly divided society in terms of politics, in terms of social model, in terms of belief in climate change. We have the technology. We have to invest massively in the renovation and in the modernization of our economy. We may just as well invest in a model of the economy which is cleaner, safer, and which can be imitated by others. And as I said at the beginning, we don't see a different model capable of succeeding. A model that does not combine A clean economy with prosperity is, in our view, very unlikely to receive the required support. So in many ways we are fortunate. We don't have to make a choice. There isn't one in that respect. Madam President, I'm sorry it took so long.
It was very good, and I think for our members, Mr. Petriccioni, very informative and very helpful for our work, and we really welcome that offer of engagement with your office into the future, and we'll try and work as constructively as we can with you. So on that note, I'd like to thank you again, and Mr. Ducrier and Mr. Kiley for coming before us this afternoon. So our meeting is adjourned of the Joint Committee. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you.